I never thought my own parents would betray me like this. Family is supposed to have your back, to support you, not to throw you into financial ruin behind your back. But that's exactly what happened. It all started one ordinary evening. I was sitting in my apartment, sipping coffee, and scrolling through my emails when a notification from my credit card company popped up. Unusual activity detected on your account. Please review your latest transactions. My stomach dropped. I had always been careful with my money. I rarely used my credit card unless absolutely necessary. So seeing a fraud alert like this immediately set off alarm bells. I clicked the link and logged into my account. What I saw nearly made me drop my coffee. $100,247.56. That was my current balance. What the hell? I scrolled through the transactions, my heartbeat racing. Flights, luxury hotel stays, designer shopping sprees, 5-star restaurants, first-class tickets. It went on and on. Then it hit me. My sister Emily. She had just come back from a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Europe. My parents had been raving about how much fun she had, how it was the experience she deserved before she started college. Had they used my card to fund the whole thing? I felt sick. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mother's number. "Hey, sweetheart," she answered cheerfully, as if nothing was wrong. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Did you use my credit card to pay for Emily's trip?" Silence. Then a nervous chuckle. "Oh, honey, you make it sound so serious. Are you serious?" I nearly shouted. "I have a $100,000 charge on my account. My credit score is ruined. What were you thinking?" There was a pause before my father's voice came on the line. "Calm down, son. It's not a big deal. We were going to pay you back." "With what money?" I snapped. "You don't even have savings. Emily deserved this trip." My mother cut in. "She worked so hard in high school. We knew you'd understand." "Understand? Understand what? That my parents had stolen from me? That they had maxed out my credit card to pamper my spoiled sister?" I hung up. I couldn't listen to them anymore. But this wasn't over. The next morning I called my bank. I explained the situation, hoping they could help me dispute the charges. "I'm sorry," the representative said, "but since the transactions were authorized from your household, this would not be considered fraud." I felt my stomach churn. So what? I'm just supposed to eat a $100,000 debt. "You could press legal charges against them," she suggested cautiously. "Take my own parents to court?" I wanted to scream. I was stuck with this debt, and I knew my parents had no intention of paying it back. So, I decided to do something drastic. First, I cut off my parents financially. They had always relied on me for small things. Help with bills, occasional loans, even groceries. That stopped immediately. Then I called my sister. She answered in a sing-song voice. "Hey, big bro. What's up?" "Emily," I said coldly. "Did you know Mom and Dad used my credit card to pay for your entire trip?" She was silent. "Emily," then a small hesitant. "I thought they used their own money." I scoffed. "Do they have $100,000 lying around? You really think they could afford 5-star hotels and designer clothes?" She didn't respond. "Well, guess what?" I continued. "You enjoyed that trip. Now you're going to help pay for it." "Wait, what?" "You heard me. Get a job, Emily. You're paying your share." She gasped. "That's not fair." I didn't. "Goodbye, Emily." I hung up. My parents showed up at my apartment 2 days later. "Sweetheart," my mother began, trying to sound soothing. "Let's talk about this." I folded my arms. "Oh, you want to talk now? After whopping me?" My father sighed. "We were going to pay you back." "With what money?" I snapped. "Tell me, Dad. What's your financial plan for paying back $100K? Ah, he had no answer. "That's what I thought," I said coldly. "You ruined my credit. My bank is refusing to remove the charges. Do you even care what you've done?" "You're our son," my mother said softly. "We thought you'd help family." I clenched my jaw. Helping family is one thing. Being stolen from is another. They tried to plead, to guilt-trip me. But I had already decided. I pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the coffee table. "What's this?" my father asked warily. "Legal documents," I said. "A lawsuit. Against both of you." Their faces turned pale. "You wouldn't." my mother whispered. Watch me. I wasn't bluffing. I took them to small claims court. The case was brutal. My parents begged the judge for leniency, but the facts were clear. They had stolen from me. The court ruled in my favor. They were legally required to pay me back. But since they didn't have the money, the judge approved wage garnishment. Every paycheck, a portion of their income now went directly to my account. Emily? She tried to plead with me, saying she was just a kid and didn't deserve this. But I didn't care. She got a job, started paying me in small amounts, and learned what it meant to be responsible. As for me, it took time, but I rebuilt my credit. I learned a painful lesson. Sometimes, family isn't who you can trust the most. And my parents, they finally learned that actions have consequences. Winning the lawsuit should have felt like a victory. And in some ways it was. I got justice, I held my parents accountable, and I ensured that they couldn't just walk away from their actions. But there was no real satisfaction in watching them struggle. Their wages were garnished, and they started cutting back on luxuries they once took for granted. No more dining out. No more shopping sprees for Emily. No more extravagant vacations. They even had to downsize their home. Emily blamed me. You ruined our family, she spat one night over the phone. You had to go and act like a selfish jerk, instead of just letting it go. I laughed bitterly. You're calling me selfish? I didn't spend someone else's money and expect them to deal with the consequences. You could have handled this differently. You mean by letting mom and dad screw me over? She had no response to that. The thing was, I wanted to forgive them. I wanted to move on. But every time I saw my credit score drop, every time I had to make huge payments to undo the damage they had done, I remembered why I took them to court in the first place. Family should have your back. They shouldn't betray you. Months passed. The relationship with my parents remained tense. At first, they refused to talk to me unless it was about money. They saw me as the villain, as if I was the one who had put them in this situation. But deep down they knew the truth. One evening my mother called me. Her voice was tired. We're sorry, she said quietly. It was the first genuine apology I had heard. We made a mistake, she admitted. A terrible one. And we'll be paying for it for a long time. I exhaled. Yeah, you will. I know we don't deserve your forgiveness, she continued. But I hope that one day, we can be a family again. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't ready. And I didn't know if I ever would be. Despite everything, I didn't want to hold on to anger forever. Carrying resentment would only weigh me down. So, I focused on rebuilding. I worked extra hours, paid off what I could, and slowly regained control of my finances. I started therapy to deal with the betrayal. And over time, I learned to let go. Not for their sake but for mine. As for my parents, they changed. Losing financial stability forced them to rethink their priorities. They became more responsible, more humble. Emily eventually matured too. She worked hard, paid me back little by little, and stopped acting like the spoiled princess she once was. It took years to fully recover, but I did. And while I never fully repaired my relationship with my parents, I found peace in knowing my worth. Because in the end, family isn't about blood. It's about trust. And once that trust is broken, it's not so easy to get back. Even after all the payments, all the apologies, and all the time that had passed, something inside me still felt unresolved. I had rebuilt my credit. I had moved on financially, but emotionally, I was still carrying a weight that I couldn't quite shake. One day, nearly 3 years after the whole ordeal began, I received a message from my father. Dad, can we meet for coffee? Just to talk. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. What else was there to say? But another part of me, maybe the part that still longed for a normal family, needed closure. So I agreed. When I arrived at the small coffee shop, I barely recognized him. My father looked older, weaker. The confident, sometimes arrogant man I had grown up with now looked like someone who had been beaten down by life. Hey son, he said, giving me a small smile. I nodded and sat across from him. What's up? He sighed. I wanted to see you in person. To say that I know I messed up. Your mother and I both did. I didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. We didn't just take your money, he admitted. his voice heavy with regret. We took your trust. And that's something we may never get back. I stayed quiet. I just wanted you to know, he continued, that we're proud of you. You handled this better than we ever could have. He hesitated before adding, and I know you didn't do it to punish us. You did it because you had no choice. I exhaled slowly. No, that. I didn't. He nodded, looking down at his coffee. I just hope that maybe one day, you'll want us in your life again. I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, I saw someone who wasn't just my father, but a man who had been forced to grow up later in life. A man who had suffered the consequences of his own choices, and learned from them. It didn't erase what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, it was a step forward. I didn't forgive them right away. Trust takes time to rebuild. But that conversation with my father was the first time I felt like we were finally speaking the same language. No guilt trips. No justifications. Just honesty. We started talking more. Slowly. Carefully. Emily too had changed. She had paid off her share of the debt, and was now working hard to build her own life. She called me one day, not to argue, but to say something I never expected. I get it now, she said softly. What you went through. What I put you through. It took years, but eventually, we found our way back to something that resembled family. Not perfect. Not like before. But maybe something better. Something real. And that was enough. Rebuilding trust is never easy. Especially when it's been shattered so completely. Even though my parents and I were speaking again, the scars from their betrayal ran deep. Every conversation carried a hint of hesitation. A quiet acknowledgement of the past that neither of us could fully erase. But I wasn't the same person they had stolen from. I had learned how to stand up for myself, how to say no, and how to protect what was mine. I made it clear. Things would never go back to the way they were. They had to earn my trust, not demand it. About a year after my dad and I met for coffee, I got a call from Emily. Hey, she said, her voice unusually nervous. What's up? I asked. It's Mom, she said quietly. She's sick. My heart clenched. What do you mean sick? She has cancer, Emily said, her voice cracking. Stage 3. The words hit me like a freight train. After everything they had done, after all the resentment I had carried, I never once considered the possibility of losing them. And suddenly, the anger I had held onto for so long didn't feel as important anymore. I visited my mother in the hospital. She looked fragile. Nothing like the woman who had once confidently dismissed my anger as not a big deal. When she saw me, tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't think you'd come, she whispered. Except beside her. I almost didn't. She nodded as if she understood. I know I don't deserve your kindness, she said, her voice weak. But I'm so glad you're here. And for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the money or the betrayal. I was just thinking about my mother. Mom's battle with cancer lasted a little over a year. Emily and I took turns caring for her, while my father, despite his past mistakes, never left her side. One night, as I sat with her in the hospital, she reached for my hand. I know I can't change what I did, she said softly. But I need you to know, I loved you then, and I love you now, even when I was wrong. Tears stung my eyes. I know, Mom. And I'm proud of you, she whispered. Even if you had to fight me to become the man you are. When she passed, something inside me shifted. For years, I had been carrying the weight of my parents' betrayal. But now, standing in front of my mother's grave, I realized something. It wasn't my burden to carry anymore. My mother's death brought our family together in a way that no amount of money ever could. My father was a broken man, but he worked hard to repair what was left of our relationship. Emily, now an independent woman, became one of my closest friends. She never forgot what she had put me through, but she proved day by day that she was no longer that selfish teenager who had spent thousands without a second thought. And me, I forgave them, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to move on. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Looking back, I still wish things had been different. I wish my parents had made better choices. I wish my sister hadn't been so blind to the consequences. But at the end of the day, life doesn't give you perfect families. It gives you people flawed, messy, and sometimes downright selfish. The real test isn't whether or not they fail you. It's whether they learn from it. And whether you can find it in your heart to let go. I did. And that made all the difference. Forgiving my parents was one thing. Moving on was another. Even though I had let go of the anger, I still had work to do. Emotionally, financially, and personally. My mother's passing had shaken me more than I expected. But it also reminded me of something important. Life is too short to hold on to grudges. So, I focused on the things I could control. I got a promotion at work, moved to a new apartment, and started investing my money wisely. I was determined to secure a future where no one, not even family, could take advantage of me again. Emily and I stayed close, though our relationship had changed. She still carried guilt for what happened, but I told her, what matters is who you are now, not who you were then. She took that to heart. One evening, about 2 years after my mother's passing, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find my father standing there, looking uncertain. He held a small, worn envelope in his hand. I wanted to give you something, he said, handing it to me. I took it cautiously and opened it. Inside was a check. For $50,000. I blinked, staring at the number. Dad, what is this? He sighed. It's not everything I owe you, but it's a start. I've been saving ever since the lawsuit. I didn't want you to think I'd forgotten what I did. For the first time in years, I saw him as the father I had once looked up to. Not perfect, not flawless, but trying. And that meant more than the money ever could. I accepted the check, but it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the effort, the responsibility, the growth. My father had changed. Emily had changed. And so had I. The past would always be there, but it no longer defined us. We weren't the same broken family we had once been. We had found our way forward. Not perfectly, not easily, but together. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. And that was worth more than any amount of money. The end. Even though my father had started repaying me, I realized something important. Money was never the real issue. Yes, the debt had nearly ruined me. Yes, the betrayal had left scars. But at its core, what hurt the most was losing trust in the people I had loved the most. Now, standing at a crossroads, I had to decide. Did I let the past define me forever? Or did I finally let go? I chose to let go. Not because I forgot what happened, but because I refused to let it hold me back. After that night, my relationship with my father slowly improved. He didn't try to push his way back into my life. Instead, he showed up in small ways, checking in, sending holiday cards, even just asking how I was doing. Emily, now financially independent, had grown into someone I was proud of. She worked hard, saved her money, and even started her own business. I never thought I'd say this, she admitted one night. But I'm glad you made me take responsibility back then. I wouldn't be where I am now if you hadn't. Hearing that meant everything. 2 years after my father first handed me that check, he called me over for dinner. It had been a long time since I had stepped inside my childhood home. When I arrived, he handed me another envelope. Inside was a second check. For $50,247.56. The last of what we owed, he said quietly. I know it took too long, but I needed to make this right. I stared at the check for a long moment. Then, I did something I never thought I would. I handed it back. Keep it, I said. His eyes widened. So? I don't need the money, I interrupted. What I needed was this. To know that you took responsibility, that you cared enough to make it right. He swallowed hard, emotions flickering across his face. I do care. More than you know. And in that moment, I knew that we had finally closed the chapter on the worst mistake of their lives. The past will always be a part of me. It shaped who I am. But it no longer controls me. I built a future that was my own. Free from the mistakes of my parents. I learned to protect myself, to value trust, and to stand up for what I deserved. Most of all, I learned that forgiveness isn't about letting people off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of the past. And as I moved forward, I knew one thing for sure. My life belonged to me. No one would ever take that from me again. The end. Even though I had chosen to forgive, there were moments when the past still crept up on me. Every time I checked my credit score, A small flicker of anxiety ran through me. Every time I heard stories of financial betrayal, I felt a deep, personal understanding that others couldn't. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I had built a stable life, secured my finances, and learned to trust again carefully. Still, the scars remained. One evening, I got a call from my father. Hey, so, I was wondering if we could talk. His voice was different, more hesitant, more serious. I agreed, and we met at the same coffee shop where he had first handed me that check years ago. I wanted to tell you something, he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. Something I should have said a long time ago. I waited. He sighed. I know I said we were going to pay you back all along, but the truth is, we weren't. Not at first. I tensed. He continued, looking ashamed. When we spent that money, we convinced ourselves that it was fine. That you'd be okay. That somehow, things would just work out. It wasn't until you took us to court that we really understood what we had done. I swallowed hard. I guess what I'm saying is, he said quietly, you saved us. Not just financially, but from becoming people who never took responsibility for anything. I stared at him, emotions swirling inside me. It was strange to hear him admit it so plainly. And yet, I appreciated it. Thanks for telling me, I finally said. And for the first time, I truly felt like we had put the past behind us. As my life moved forward, I found myself in a new phase, building a future with someone else. I had been dating someone for a while, and things were getting serious. Her name was Rachel, and she was everything I had never realized I needed. She was smart, independent, and, most importantly, financially responsible. One night, as we sat on the couch, she turned to me and asked, do you think you'll ever completely trust your dad again? I thought about it. Not in the way I used to, I admitted, but in a different way. I trust that he's learned, that he won't make the same mistakes again. Rachel nodded. That's fair. Some people earn back trust, just not in the same way. And I realized she was right. A year later, my father called again. But this time, it wasn't for coffee. I need some advice, he said. We're thinking of making a big financial move, and I don't want to mess it up. I almost laughed at the irony. The man who had once stolen from me was now asking me for financial advice. But instead of anger, I felt something else. Pride. Not just in him, but in myself. Because I had come full circle. And no matter where life took me next, I knew one thing for sure. I would never let anyone take advantage of me again. The end. Hearing my father ask for financial advice was something I never expected. It was surreal. This was the same man who once believed money problems would magically fix themselves. All right, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Tell me what you're thinking. He hesitated before explaining. Your mother had some savings in an old account. Nothing huge, but enough to invest. I don't want to waste it. I want to do this right. I leaned back, processing his words. This was a test, not for him but for me. Did I believe he had truly changed? Was I willing to trust him with something as important as financial responsibility? I sighed. Okay, Dad. Let's go over your options. And for the next hour, I walked him through investments, safe financial planning, and how to avoid making impulsive decisions. For the first time he listened. The past had shaped me in ways I couldn't deny. I double-checked every transaction on my accounts. I never co-signed loans. I never let anyone, no matter how much I loved them, have unchecked access to my finances. But I had also grown in ways I never expected. I had learned to set boundaries, to protect myself without shutting people out. And most importantly, I had learned that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. I would never erase what happened, but I wouldn't let it define me either. Years later, as I stood at my wedding, looking at Rachel, my partner, my best friend, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. I wasn't just starting a new chapter. I was building a new legacy. One where trust wasn't broken. One where financial security wasn't a gamble. One where my future children would never have to go through what I did. As my father hugged me after the ceremony, I could tell he knew it too. I'm proud of you, son, he whispered. For the first time in my life, I believed him. And that was the only closure I ever needed. Epilogue, the final lesson. People always say, family is everything. But the truth is, Family is only as strong as the trust you build. I had nearly lost mine, but through time, hard lessons, and painful growth, we have found our way back. Not to what we were, but to something better. Something earned. Something real. And as I stepped forward into this new chapter of my life, I knew one thing for certain. The past didn't define me. I did. The end. Marriage brought new challenges but also new joys. For the first time, I had someone by my side who truly understood me, who had seen my struggles, my scars, and still chose to love me. Rachel and I had deep conversations about our future, about finances, about trust. One night, as we lay in bed, she turned to me and asked, "Do you think you'll ever let your parents fully back into your life?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know one thing. I won't make the same mistakes they did. When we have kids, they'll never have to question if they can trust us." Rachel squeezed my hand. "Then we've already won." And for the first time, I truly believed that. A few years later, Rachel and I welcomed our first child, a boy we named Ethan. Holding him in my arms for the first time was overwhelming in a way I hadn't expected. I looked down at this tiny, innocent life and thought about my own childhood. The good moments, the betrayals, the lessons learned. I made a silent promise to him right then and there. I will never let you feel the pain I went through. I would be the kind of father who was reliable, honest, and financially responsible. I would never put my own wants above my child's needs. I would break the cycle. When Ethan turned 1, my father asked to meet. I agreed, but this time I brought Rachel and Ethan with me. When my dad saw his grandson for the first time, something in his expression shifted. Like he realized just how much time had passed, how much had changed. "He's beautiful," my father said quietly. "Yeah," I replied. "And he'll grow up knowing trust isn't something you take for granted." My father looked down, ashamed but understanding. "I know I can't undo what I did, son. But I hope, one day, you'll let me prove I can be a better grandfather than I was a father." I studied him carefully. The man who had once stolen from me was gone. In his place was someone older, humbler, more aware of his mistakes. "Maybe," I said finally. "But that's up to you to prove." And for the first time, I saw hope in his eyes. Life isn't about being perfect. It's about learning, growing, and making better choices than the ones before you. I couldn't erase the past, but I could shape the future. For me, for Rachel, for Ethan. And as I watched my son take his first steps, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was truly living. And that made all the difference. The end.